Good afternoon. I think we can already start. Let me welcome you to our panel discussion today about the topic, what future for the European peace and security communities? My name is Stephanie FENKART. I'm the director of the International Institute for Peace. I'm going to be moderating today, but in a very, I would say, backwards fashion. So the focus is on our experts here, and I look forward to an interesting discussion. I would also like to welcome, of course, BERNARDO VENTURI, who is the director and co-founder of the Bologna Peace Forum, and we did this event in cooperation, so thanks a lot for the cooperation. I'm going to introduce the speakers, of course, in a second, but I would also like to welcome especially you, that you're able and also interested in topics dealing with international security, and especially in this context, European security. I look to a fruitful discussion. There are many, many different things we are going to address, or we want to address, and I'm already quite doubtful that we're going to have like the solution in the end, but I think, and I'm quite optimistic that maybe we can also shape some ideas about how the discussion should be evolving in the future, especially when it comes to these European security communities, which might sound a little bit interesting since it's the word in plural. And this is also what I mean with European security communities is we do have, of course, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, but there are also NATO just was quite revived, I would say, and it seems to be no alternative to NATO in this sense for the moment. But there's also Macron with his different initiatives, especially also the political community, which also already bases on several other French ideas beforehand, for example, the Conference on the Future of Europe. So also giving this European incentive in talking about, or enabling, let's call it a forum, and where we can discuss also geopolitical positions and maybe also find a basis on how we deal with all the threats and challenges we are facing today. Today is a very special day because we are going into the first year of this brutal war which Russia is raging in Ukraine against Ukrainians, and I think this is of course the background also of many of the talks we are now discussing, especially when it comes to the future of the OSCE, considering that at least formally it's the only forum where Ukraine and Russians are still in. As I said, formally, because we know that it seems to be super blocked. I mean, when we talk about the budget last year, I'm not sure if it ever actually went through it. There's problems with budget. There's many, many other issues which I think are important to discuss when it comes to security of Europe and also what we are facing in the next couple of years. Therefore, I would like to introduce already our first speaker, who is, you might know him, former General Secretary Lamberto ZANNIER. Welcome. You have been a very, very long diplomatic career. I already mentioned former General Secretary of the OSCE, but you also used to be the OSCE High Commissioner for Minorities, and you're now an advisor to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Welcome. I'm very happy that you managed to come here to share with us your thoughts about the role of the OSCE nowadays. What can it mean for the future? You have been Secretary General, for example, when the SSM was established, because the war did not start in 2022, as we know, but already in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, and also at least very supported separatist forces, including weapons in the east of the country. So maybe you can reflect a little bit on what was the hope there in 2014 until right now, also considering that so many people are saying that the OSCE is totally blocked, and what this actually means for the future of cooperative security, and ultimately, of course, also for the security of Europe. Welcome, the floor is yours, and I would kindly ask you not to exceed the next, your statement for 5 up to 7 minutes, and yes.
So thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. The OSCE, and let's start from that. The OSCE is a very topical issue now because, as you know, there is a meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly coming up, the winter session, and the presence of the Russian delegation is quite controversial in a way. The Austrian hosts feel that they have to respect the obligations they have vis-à-vis the organization, that is to accept all the members of the organization. The invitation was not issued by Austria, was issued by the Parliamentary Assembly, and the members are there. There were initiatives in the Parliamentary Assembly to try to suspend Russia, but there are also rules of procedure, and the rules foresee that for this kind of decisions, you need to have an old mechanism established in the early 90s, which is consensus -1. And obviously you have more than one objection to the suspension of the Russian Federation. So this didn't work. The Ukrainians were frustrated. So they decided that if the Russians are in the room, they will not come. But they are in Vienna and they're having bilateral discussions in the margins. This is where we are, and tomorrow afternoon there will be a meeting of the Bureau, and then on Thursday morning the plenary, and then we'll see how the meeting takes place, runs in practice. The OSCE was conceived as a space for interaction, cooperation, and more important, a space of dialogue. There were a number of principles that were agreed among the countries for this dialogue. In spite of that, during the Cold War, it was useful to have that space, but especially in the first phase, it was very difficult to have this kind of dialogue. You could see that the OSCE had been built to try to have some kind of relationship between enemies. It was NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and at that time the so-called neutral and non-allied countries were playing a role of go-between between the two opposing blocs. Then, of course, in the 80s, the situation changed. In the 90s, there were new documents approved. The organization grew, institutionalized itself, took root here in Vienna, because before it was a bit of a traveling circus, meeting in various places as a conference. Something that we notice in the OSCE is that in the 90s were, I think, the key to understanding what's happening today, because it was in the 90s that some of the decisions that are affecting the European security today were taken. First of all, the succession to a number of countries, the former Yugoslavia and the conflicts that ensued, but also the former Soviet Union. There we had less conflict in the beginning, even though we had some complicated ones that we, in the OSCE jargon, called frozen conflicts, like Nagorno-Karabakh or Transnistria, etc., but not major things. But below the surface, there were tensions, and there were, how can I say, relations developed in ways that were a reaction to the overall evolution of the European security architecture. And the Russians are very quick now at pointing at NATO enlargement as the cause of all this, and saying that the reaction was that Russia should be able to create a space, a security space around itself. And that's how, the strong relations with Belarus, at the time with Ukraine. I was in Kiev in 2004, was it, the first Maidan? And I remember the Russian ambassador there was a kind of a Russian governor almost of Ukraine. Was very powerful. He was the one, it was at the time Chernomyrdin, former Soviet prime minister, who was really the powerful man around. And so the Russians were sort of controlling very closely the relations with the neighboring countries. In the OSCE, and of course, the relation between Russia and NATO, that would require a discussion, debate just itself. But Russia was exploring ways of enhancing its own cooperation with NATO in the 90s. But Russia had its own vision of NATO. It was say NATO, you say it's a defensive alliance, defensive against whom? Maybe NATO should reform itself, become a space for cooperation in the field of defense, maybe provide support to UN peacekeeping, and we'll be interested in joining in these efforts. But then the decisions were taken inside NATO that no, NATO will become a tool of support to the, democratic countries and the democratic development. So the enlargement, the way it was conceived, would make sense in that case. With Russia, will develop its own kind of relationship, which was not enough for the Russians. But what we saw in the OSCE in all this is that during the 90s, Russia and the West were cooperating. That's where they adopted mechanisms like consensus -1 that was used to suspend the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And Russia agreed to that, and the West and Russia were agreeing. Every year, ministers were adopting a joint political statement at the ministerials. And this went on until 2002. After 2002, no matter how hard any chairmanship tried, they never managed to get an agreed political statement. So at that point, we had gone beyond the watershed, in a way. We reached a point where we didn't see eye to eye anymore. And that's where the OSCE started to fail, because the dialogue was not really there anymore on the real serious security issues. Yes, there was cooperation in fighting against terrorism. The organization started developing a much broader agenda addressing global challenges, etc. And there was good cooperation. But when it came to security perceptions of individual countries, and especially Russia and NATO discussion, this was not really at the center of things. And we saw that some of the security tools, arms control, the CFE treaty, etc., started losing speed and then in the end failed. So this is in the background of what I'm saying, because when we reached the point where Ukraine had a crisis, Ukraine, that's another discussion we could have in its own merit. Ukraine chaired the OSCE in 2013, and I was Secretary General, so I was in Ukraine every other day. I visited Crimea, I was in Donbass, etc. And the Ukrainians, I met twice with Yanukovych, who told me, we made a strategic decision, we want to move towards the European Union, but we need to do it at our own pace. We cannot really shut down our relations with Russia. It has to be gradual, and it has to be a smooth transition. And the Europeans will say, you are either with us at our conditions or you're not. And Putin told him whatever he had to tell the Ukrainians. They were dependent on Russian gas and all that. So Yanukovych found himself without really a possibility to find a way. He had to refuse, and then Maidan started, and that's it. And in Russia, they were very quick in saying this is a coup, and it's undermined. And so it all comes from here. Crimea, some of the Russians told me as soon as in Kiev they start talking about NATO and Ukraine joining NATO, we cannot jeopardize Sevastopol, and then, of course, history, and then the design of Putin. I think this is the other thing. But in all this, the OSCE started suffering. Still, in 2014, I remember I went to Moscow, discussed with Lavrov himself the SMM thing, and we managed to get the Russians on board. The price was to have a Russian contingent, but which was normal. It's the OSCE, so all OSCE countries should be part of this. I even negotiated the number, saying how much percent you pay for the budget of the organization, 8%? 8% of the staff, so that we maintain the proportion. And we managed to continue working. But when I saw Minsk appearing, and people were telling me what's the problem with the Minsk negotiation, from what I saw, the Russians were saying it's not our issue, it's the separatists, and the separatists, you just couldn't talk to them. It was totally unreasonable, their attitude. And my interpretation of this is that, the conflict in Eastern Ukraine is not really about Eastern Ukraine, it's about Ukraine itself. Russia wants to keep a pressure on Ukraine and wants to undermine its Western-oriented policies and hopefully in their view, influence also the future political course of the country. And when this didn't work, then substitution came in, and that's what led also to the beginning of this operation. Now, I'm saying all this because we need to understand this to see the future and to see what's going on there, or what's going on now. First of all, 2 points. First of all, the dialogue inside the OSCE doesn't exist anymore. You see exchanges of accusations. It's used for propaganda, especially by Russia. If you hear Russian statements, they are, the replica of the things you hear on Russian media. So the Russians use the OSCE just to convey their own interpretation of what's happening, which is, of course, rejected, first of all, by the Ukrainians, but then by everybody else. So it's simply an empty exchange of accusations, and then sometimes gets very... so we don't need an organization for that. What can the OSCE do in this space? In my view, the OSCE should have at least tried to do what Turkey did. Little things to try to address some of the consequences of the conflict. But promoting a ceasefire in this condition, and we can talk about ceasefire maybe later, is a different thing. So looking ahead, the big challenge for the OSCE, the way I see it, is that if you compare it to the dialogue between enemies of the 70s, there was the acceptance of the rules of the game, the principles, etc. Now the rules of the games are not respected. They've been, the Russian invasion is the contrary to all basic rules of the interaction, the cooperation in the OSCE. So if the rules are not respected, what is the basis for the interaction, and what is the basis for the way forward? Is Russia going to, with the end of the conflict, going to return to a world regulated by, a world order that is regulated by rules that are commonly agreed? Or is it the law of the jungle and the strongest one? So this is, I think, going to be the big question that the OSCE will face in determining the way forward.
Thank you very much. I think you already gave us also a lot of food for thought, and I think that our next speaker, Stefanie Liechtenstein, will also reflect on it. And maybe just to introduce you very briefly, you're a diplomatic correspondent and a journalist with focus on multilateral diplomacy, foreign and security policy, disarmament and nuclear disarmament, also on the JCPOA, for example, but also, of course, on the OSCE. So maybe of what you just heard, Stefanie, Mr. ZANNIER said there is no dialogue at the moment, there is especially also no trust. So how can we actually deal with this situation when it comes to security of Europe? The war is going on in Ukraine, so many people already died there, infrastructure is destroyed, cities are shelled, with all the horrors which come with the war. How are we actually going to deal with it in the future? And also coming back to that big question about always what we were thinking in the last couple of years, like how to include Russia into this system. And if we look at it right now, I mean, I would say there is very, very little room, considering like all the circumstances. No trust, no dialogue, and then also the international law, what you just mentioned. And additionally, there is also the threat with a nuclear escalation, and I think which came from Putin. And I think this is a taboo. I mean, we do know about the deterrence argument for many, many years, but actual threatening as ultima ratio with something like nuclear weapons, I think, is very, very new in this sense. So maybe from your point of view, how do you assess the situation right now when it comes to the future of cooperative security? And I also know that you have been at the Munich Security Conference just recently. So maybe you can also shed a little bit light on how was the situation there when it comes to this issue, like besides also the typical cooperation between the US and NATO and all those issues. So the floor is yours, and please feel free also to react to what Mr. ZANNIER already said. Many questions, not so much time, so...
Okay, thank you very much also for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Yes, those were many questions. I'm trying to just organize a bit my thoughts and also reply to some of the things that you said, Lamberto. We've known each other for a very long time, so I can relate to many of the things that you just mentioned now and that you explained very eloquently, the way the OSCE has tried over decades I mean, if you look back to the 1970s, actually over 5 decades, it has tried a dialogue with Russia. It has tried cooperation with Russia through all kinds of ways that, you know, I mean, it would take another panel discussion to discuss all of them. The fact is, today, we have a full-fledged war in Europe, and the very tough question we need to ask ourselves is why? Why, after 5 decades of trying cooperation and trying dialogue in the context of the OSCE, but also many other formats, why have we reached this point? And I think the answer, this is where I disagree a little bit with your assessment, is not that this is an East-West conflict. I think this is a Russian spin to say that this is an East-West conflict where their security interests have been ignored over many decades. I think it's a very brutal war of imperial conquest. This is what this is all about. It's not more complicated than that. And if you look at Putin's speeches and his famous or infamous manifesto from last year, which everyone can download from the Kremlin website, I mean, it's written in there. It says basically black on white that Ukraine should not exist as a state, as a sovereign state. So I think this is something we all need to keep in mind, and we need to keep this in mind for the future. What happens if at some point, hopefully, maybe there is a ceasefire or a settlement, if this is still with Putin as president or someone similar, we need to keep in mind that it may not work again with another cooperative security organization. And I know this is a very, very sad and tough thing to realize and also to admit to ourselves who have worked on maybe decades of cooperation with Russia, that for some reason it has not worked. And there has been apparently another plan by Mr. Putin for re-establishing some sort of imperial Russia in the modern world, where this kind of warfare we all had hoped and thought was a thing of the past. So I think it's very unfortunate when you look at the OSCE today. It has developed over the decades so many fascinating confidence-building measures, everything that just came out of dialogue, everything politically binding, yet everything by consensus, negotiated in many, many lengthy, painstaking negotiations. In the end, the result was always, at least for me, while I was working at the OSCE and also as an outsider, fascinating to look at, that you can achieve such things just by cooperating and negotiating and keeping a dialogue. Yet today, all of this is gone. We should be very clear about this. The OSCE has currently lost its function. It's a paralyzed institution, not only because it doesn't have a budget and it doesn't have a chair for 2024, but simply because this concept of cooperation is no longer viable. And one of the, I would say, symbols is the current discussion about whether Russians should even still be allowed into OSCE meetings and whether it makes sense to keep up a dialogue with them. Because as you explained very well, most of the time this is not a dialogue, it's just propaganda. And many diplomats that I've been speaking to who used to be very much in favor of this dialogue and in keeping the doors for dialogue open tell me that why should they sit in the room and listen to this propaganda? What's the added value? What's the meaningful purpose here? So I don't have the answer how the OSCE will re-emerge from this current situation, but my feeling is there will have to be some form of a reconfiguration of this institution, because you cannot ignore the fact that we have tried cooperation for almost 5 decades, and this is the result of it. So I think this is unfortunately one of the conclusions we have to make. So this is my first point on the OSCE. Now your other questions.
Especially on disarmament and also about breaking this taboo. I mean, above everything, what is going on now on the ground, on the battlefield, there always looms like this, the fear of which many people also share in different European Union countries. There is even a new study, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung just did another one where people actually reacted to that, ordinary people reacted to that, what they are fearing in this conflict, if it is a nuclear escalation or an escalation in general. So this is what is looming behind it, and this is of course what the West does not really want to risk. Also because there was the threat coming that maybe as ultima ratio tactical nuclear weapons might be used. But then again, we also saw in that Putin in his state today, in his statement today, he also suspended the prolongation of START 2, for example. Yeah. So there is nothing left of disarmament, and this in general cannot bring more security even to Europe, considering like all the circumstances. So how would you assess also the situation, like next to what is going on the battlefield and all the discussions with delivering of weapons, etc. What else could be done in order to restore, maybe not cooperative security in general, but at least to set some incentives about what we should be discussing in the future for the security of all of Europe?
Yes, thank you for the questions again. I think on the nuclear threat, it would be naive to say that there is no threat. Of course, there is a threat, but overreacting to that potential threat is also not a good idea, I think, because this is exactly what Russia wants us to do. This is what Putin wants us to do. He wants us, he wants our leaders in the European and the US, European countries in the United States to feel afraid. And I think we should try to assess the situation as rationally as possible, if it is possible at all. But I think, I mean, 2 points on this. Today's announcement is, of course, not good at all. It was, as you said, it was the last treaty between the United States and Russia that limits strategic nuclear warheads and the delivery systems of those warheads. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is now the first time that there's virtually no arms control treaty since the 1970s. So it's quite an unprecedented situation, and it's also, if you look into the future, the treaty was prolonged by the Biden administration in 2021 until 2026, and everyone was hoping that by 2026 there could have been a new treaty or another prolongation. And I think this is just out of the question now. In my view, the New START treaty is over, it's dead, and it's very complicated to imagine that there will be another treaty anytime soon. I'm not entirely 100% sure what the consequences will be, but I think it's fair to say that maybe in the long term, there's quite a potential for an arms race. At least there's less transparency because there are no more inspections and no more verification. And there's also a lot of unpredictability, a lot of less strategic stability, let's put it like that. And that's always a potential for escalation in such a situation, of course. When it comes to the nuclear threat, I think that there were a few threats in today's speech by Putin on purpose, obviously. But I mean, I don't have any intelligence information, but from what we know, the United States made very clear via military channels, maybe also political channels, to the Russians what the consequences of nuclear weapon use would be. And I think the Russians are quite aware of what those consequences could be in the different scenarios. And I'm pretty sure they know that it's not in their strategic interest to use nuclear weapons. But obviously that doesn't exclude that possibility completely. So we don't know exactly, but I would still say that while there is a threat and while the stakes are quite high, we shouldn't panic about it. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I think we can come back to some issues maybe in a second round, and I look forward to that. But before we do that, I would like to introduce again Bernardo Venturi. He's the co-founder and director of the Bologna Peacebuilding Forum, coming from Italy, and also a cooperation partner in this event. Thank you for coming, Bernardo. Maybe you can, after what you just heard, I mean, we heard that the OSCE and cooperative security is in dire strait. I think we can fairly agree on that. On the other hand, there is also the risk of escalation still there, still looming. But next to OSCE and disarmament and international agreements, there is something else which has also been on the table recently, which is, of course, coming from not the European Union itself, but at least from one European Union important member state, which is France, and there it is Macron. And he introduced just recently last year this concept of a political community, which gathers around, I think, 44 states in Europe, more or less. They had the first meeting in October in Prague, and nobody really knows what is really going to come out of it. But it is a new initiative where it seems he also tries to bring in a dialogue forum or some forum where European countries can discuss also security issues, but from a political leverage, I think, and at least to find like some basic, I don't know, common grounds on how they think the future of that security should be shaped. And they obviously, he didn't choose for, I guess, obvious reasons, the OSCE to be that forum, but to initiate something new. So maybe besides calling a little bit, besides reflecting on OSCE, if you would like to, but please also talk a little bit about this political community, what can it mean? And since you're also working in peace building, I mean, what can actually bring peace building into this whole discussion? Because we're talking so much about the necessity of delivery of weapons, which I'm not denying, but I mean, there could also be complementary to that other issues which we should probably tackle. And what is your assessment on this? And thanks for coming.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks to all your colleagues also working in the backstage, and for convening this event together. Yeah, are very tough questions, and I think it's complicated today to think forward and also to think constructively and positively on something really in terms of cooperation and so on. But I think we should try and to have a little bit of forward-looking, not just to be to think to what is going on today, and probably we should think to what will happen in 5, 10 years as well. So about the European political community, I think it's something interesting, and I will discuss why. And the first point is about what we call today the title about European peace and security communities. And what the peace and security community is, this could be the first question. Is this just about defense? I don't think it's the same, it's something different. So defense, of course, it's tied to a political security community, but it's not exactly the same. And even on the Munich Security Conference, I was not there, but I was listening and watching. And there were an overwhelming numbers of speeches about really about defense and weapon supplies. And of course, when we discuss about Ukraine today, this is really the case. But I was a little bit impressed that there was a little bit vision and forward looking, except for some side events that were more on different challenges, also on environmental challenges. We were here 1 year before discussing about security and climate change and these kind of issues that are still on the table and still relevant, I would like to say. So the first point is really about that the peace and security community is thinking about common threats. And if you think to do the environment protection and climate change, climate crisis, it's really about a common threat. And I think on the European continent, we should continue to work in this way. Having said that, it's challenging to find the right format. You already discussed quite a lot about the OSCE, saying that today it's quite useless as it is. It used to be an important organization for several reasons, people-centered, with very good results in terms of confidence building, and that's something important. We cannot destroy what was positive. But today, I mean, it's not dialogue and so on. So what could be the right format? I think that the European political community can go in the right direction to some extent, because it moved from, I think, two main needs that today we are just discussing about Russia, not Russia, but there were two big needs at the beginning. The first was to include the UK after Brexit back in the discussion and in the community. And the second one was about EU enlargement. There were several countries, we know the Western Balkans, you're working a lot on Western Balkans, that were still pending in terms of membership, and there was something in between, and there was a bad feeling about that. So the idea was also to have a continental community that was inclusive, with the UK, with the countries that are still waiting for access, and some other, of course, the Caucasus and Turkey as well. So that was, I think, the political perspective. And I think in that perspective was important. Also, during the first meeting in October, there were some results on that dimension. In the UK, more dialogue, more cooperation, in a phase that is completely, I mean, a mess with Brexit and different, quite complicated in terms of dialogue and mutual understanding, in particular for France. And secondly, we have seen, and you know better than me, the dialogue between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and of course the issues on the ground are still complicated. But at the same time, I mean, that was a venue where the people met and discussed, and from that meeting was also approved the CSDP mission, the EU CSDP mission, so it was a step forward also in terms of operational. And if I think to the next meeting that will be in Moldova, June the 1st, I think it's an important meeting. Try to think, Moldova is a country that today, I mean, it's threatened by Russia still. The people are afraid when I talk with colleagues there, I mean, researchers, academics, and so on. I mean, the people are still living in an uncomfortable situation because they have troubles every day as they have in Ukraine in terms of electricity, hot water, and so on. So very concrete problem, but also because they feel that, I mean, there is a threat. To try to think to have 45, 46 countries, EU countries gathering in Chisinau in 3-4 months, okay? That's the idea. And that is a big signal. We said that Biden in Kiev was a big signal yesterday, and it was. I mean, but try to think the European community gathering, discussing together about political issues, about peace, about security in Chisinau. In Moldova, this is a country that is still with a frozen conflict with Transnistria and so on. It is threatened by Russia, like last week. In a community that today is excluding Russia and Belarus for clear reasons that we know very well. But at the same time, it's really continental. It's really trying to include also countries that are complicated, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, or if we think, we could discuss about Turkey and so on. So I appreciate the idea, I think could be in this informal setting, could be a good way for the, let's say at least medium term. I don't know about the future, it's hard to say and to discuss without the Secretariat how we last and how we, but I mean, at the moment could be interesting.
Thank you very much. I would like to give you the floor now immediately, so we can have a short second round, because I think you should also be able to react towards each other, and maybe additionally to what you want to react to what the other speakers have been saying. I also wanted to ask you, maybe you can also reflect on the importance of silent or backdoor diplomacy. I mean, is this still something which is going on? I mean, we heard that very surprisingly yesterday Biden came to Kiev, and it is quite obvious that the Russians were at least informed about that. So there has to be some channels. We also know that when it comes to, for example, the nuclear threat, I'm pretty sure that the Americans are very, very openly, I mean, not openly in the sense of that it's public, but that they are talking with the Russians about what this would actually mean for them. And of course, then there is the prisoners exchange and grain deals and all the other things which could actually change also the daily life of people on the ground. And that includes, of course, also how do we actually can support from the outside, for example, civil society in war areas, and and dissidents, and like all those other issues which are additionally to the delivery of weapon could somehow, I don't know, shape the conflict in a positive way, in the sense of how can we at one point actually get to a basis where we can talk about getting out of this brutal situation. But please feel free to answer, of course, and to reflect on what Stefanie and Bernardo said first. So very briefly, in not longer than 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, the first point I wanted to make was to reassure Stefanie that we don't disagree on the interpretation. I used an OSCE jargon, which is the violation of all the principles of Helsinki, but to mean exactly that. This is a brutal invasion of other countries, and we know what Putin's design is to rebuild the glorious Russian empire. So that's, and he's doing it in different ways in different places. With Belarus, he's very effective in this kind of a gradual absorption, and that's where perhaps the strategy, the very principled policy of the West vis-à-vis Belarus of supporting the opposition, isolating, is facilitating Putin. Because the West will not defend Lukashenko, of course, and so Putin has, in a way, free hand to try to increasingly take over, and it will take the time, but we've seen the change. With Ukraine, it's different because, of course, Ukraine had already developed links with the West. The West is providing ammunition and weapons and all that. So that's where the East-West thing starts kicking in a bit. And this may get worse if you look at the policy of Russia vis-à-vis what they call the compatriots abroad. In Ukraine already they are using the presence of Russian speakers as the main pretext for what they started doing. And the rest are, Nazi, whatever. But then there are countries, Moldova is one in the list, of course, and not only Transnistria, but also in the rest of Moldova there are Russian communities. There is Gagauzia, which is Turkish, but also Russian speakers, etc. The Baltic countries, they're scarce stiff. They have large Russian-speaking communities, and the Russians feel that they have to protect them. So these might be areas, once Ukraine is somehow dealt with, that might come in the line of fire, so the special attention. So that's the concern, and that's the risk of further expansion of the conflict if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, and that's why the West is intervening. But that's why there is a risk also of increasing spiralization of the conflict. So in all this, there is a space to try to do things. And I was mentioning myself, the things that Turkey did, maybe the OSCE could have tried also to do. And there will be continuing need for that. And there will have to be a plurality of actors involved in this. Of course, the Americans and the Russians are talking. They have channels, and unfortunately, luckily, those mechanisms have not been dismantled, and we hope that they remain. But overall, I have to say the concern is that as we build, including in the OSCE, a number of mechanisms to try to diffuse crisis at the beginning, all these mechanisms have been made ineffective or been dismantled. And the START 2 thing is only the last one, but we had the INF before, which was a very worrying also development. So we will need, of course, in a situation where there is open war, it's very difficult to say, let's return to disarmament and cooperative security, but we need to prepare ourselves for the phase afterwards. And that's where, you know, looking ahead, also for the OSCE or for an organization that covers that space, it will be important to have that very high on the agenda. It will be important to mobilize public opinion to return, to rebuild mechanisms that in a way reassure and facilitate, how can I say, the dismantlement of weapons and then the creation of more stable, secure situation for all. So certainly in that direction we need to move. But now it is very difficult. Now the space is limited to addressing some of the immediate consequences of the conflict, alleviating the problems of the people on the ground. As I say, using plurality of actors, including civil society organizations, to try to see where space can be found. In the OSCE, I was even proposing, why don't we talk to the Atomic Agency and see if we can assist them with some kind of a SMM-like operation in their engagement on the nuclear power plant. That's quite a serious issue, and assuming that it's probably extremely difficult to do, but one should try every possible you know, angle and avenue. So this is what we have, but to try and stop the conflict is another story, and that's very difficult. When you come to mediation, well, first of all, you see the positions of the two sides. The Russians will want to start talking from the perspective of acknowledging what they have achieved and probably getting more than what they have now, because they will want at least Kharkiv and Slaviansk and whatever else. The Ukrainians are not ready to have a dialogue unless there is a clear indication of a return to the situation, the pre-war situation. And what is it pre-war? Is it a year ago or is it 2014? So even that is quite an issue. So to have any kind of, how can I say, engagement with the sides that would require flexibility on any of these objectives, you would need actors that have a very, very strong leverage on the two sides. So the Chinese might have strong leverage on the Russians. They don't have it on the Ukrainians, though. So the Chinese alone, I don't think that they can go very far, assuming that they want to try to pressure Russia, which remains to be seen. And in the West, is anybody going to encourage the Ukrainians to be a bit more flexible when it comes to their objectives? It doesn't look like that to me now. So unfortunately, the logic remains on assisting the country that is the victim of the aggression for the West. But then, more broadly, we see that when it comes to condemning Russia, there are a number of major global players that are very cautious. And so it won't be easy to put that kind of pressure on Russia either. So unfortunately, we will have to wait for the conflict to continue and keep supporting Ukraine in this effort until the realization comes in that at some point things have to finish, and then the conditions become more, suitable for a conclusion of the conflict. Unfortunately, this is my own personal analysis, and it's not very good news. But there will be a lot of work to do afterwards, and that's where we will need also this space for re-engagement. But we'll have to pick up the pieces and see, what everybody will be ready to do. And there are lots of lessons learned. The use or misuse of history in conflict. Look at Putin's speech when he started the invasion. This is something that needs to be thought of, because in dealing with conflicts from the time when I was SRG in Kosovo, I was given history lessons by the Serbs and by the Kosovars, and the history was very different depending on where you were sitting. And Putin's speech shows that once again. So there are many lessons that I think we should also think about and consider in the future.
So if I understand you right, and this is also what many analysts are saying these days, is that so much will depend first for the time being on what is going on the battleground. And this is of course very, very painful to accept, first of all for everyone being directly involved in the conflict, so the Ukrainians itself of course being on the ground, but of course also for us who actually try to find some ways out of it. So it's a very, very painful and difficult situation, and I cannot agree more on that. So we really need to see like what is going to happen and when is the right timing for actually coming up with some vision. So I think it still makes sense, as you also said, that we already need to think ahead about the future, and this is where disarmament is coming in. But of course also other security challenges, since Ukraine and the war in Russia is waging against Ukraine is not the only security challenge Europe is facing. And I think this is also something we shouldn't at least forget, in the sense of climate change and terrorism. And then there is still also the infrastructure debate and energy security. And this goes, of course, way beyond Europe in general. Stephanie, maybe very briefly on another topic, just concerning the importance of NATO and the revival of NATO, because we know that you mentioned before, it's not really about East and West division, this whole war, but it's also a war of imperialism. So, but nevertheless, I think NATO always was something which Putin bothered a lot. And even in 2007, at the same conference you just attended, he made it also quite clear, and for some even surprisingly clear, and wasn't taken too seriously in that sense. And afterwards, NATO lost a lot of leverage for many, many years in the transatlantic cooperation. We remember Trump calling it, I think NATO is obsolete, and Macron called it brain dead. And now we see something very, very different. We see the revival of NATO. We do have now Sweden and Finland NATO accession. It will most probably happen anytime soon. And this leaves especially like countries like Austria or maybe also Malta and Ireland in a very difficult position, because we still are militarily neutral, and we are going out and trying always to give the impression that we are militarily neutral, but we are not morally neutral. So nevertheless, what does this mean also for European security? I mean, how do different states also perceive different security threats? And maybe also on this occasion you can reflect a little bit about it.
Thank you very much for the question. You've given me a very sensitive question to address in Austria. Yes, I think, first, before I address your question, I agree with Lamberto. The moment is not here yet for a solution or a ceasefire or a negotiated settlement of this war. It's unfortunately, there are different military experts who have different scenarios how this is going to end. But it looks like it's more a war of attrition, where both sides still believe that they can make lots of gains on the battlefield, so that they have more leverage in a future ceasefire negotiation. This is unfortunately the current situation, where the West, in my opinion, needs to stick together, show a lot of solidarity, and it's just all about weapons at the moment. Again, this is something very complicated for people I'm assuming for people like you, Lamberto. You have really worked for cooperation and dialogue for most of your career, and so right now the situation is very, very different, and I think a lot will also depend on the next couple of months, about the offensive and the counteroffensive. And because you mentioned Munich several times, there was also a very clear expression of fear that maybe China is going to start supporting Russia with lethal weapons. And I think a lot depends also on that, how much support Russia is going to get, not only from Iran, but also from China, and how that affects the battlefield. So unfortunately, the next couple of months, I think, will not be very nice to watch. But on your second question, the two are actually very much connected. I think we are currently in a drastically changed security environment. Austria is not an island. Austria is in the middle of Europe. The battlefield is geographically very close, if you think about it. Yet, if you live in Austria and if you observe the public debate, it almost seems like we are an island. Nothing has changed around us. Every time someone tries to initiate a debate about Austria's security policy, that debate is almost, I would say, killed by the politicians instantly. One reason being that the concept of neutrality is very much supported by the public. It's part of our constitution, which also means that it requires a 2/3 majority in parliament to be changed. So admittedly, it's not an easy thing just to change overnight, like Sweden and Finland. The situation is a bit different. Also, the situation is different in the sense how they have invested in their armies, in their military over the last decades, as opposed to Austria. Austria's military is in a dreadful situation. So even if tomorrow a decision is taken that Austria will join NATO, that would not even be feasible, because NATO would probably not want to take Austria because of its the state of its army. So I think one of the things that bothers me in this discussion is as if Austria was an island, and it's just not the case. And I think there needs to be a public debate, and there are lots of steps you can take before taking a radically different decision like joining NATO. You could, for example, start a discussion about how to upgrade the army and how to improve the situation for the military, so that in the end you could at least argue that you are capable of defending your neutrality, like Switzerland. Switzerland, a country comparable in size and population, which is also a neutral country, also hosts the UN and several other international organizations. If I'm not mistaken, invests twice as much or even more in its army than Austria. So I think that would be a first step. And another very important step, in my view, would be for the political leadership to allow a public debate and to also explain in an honest way to the Austrian public what the risks are if nothing is changed, and if there's no development about the security policy of this country in the future. Because I think it would be a mistake to think that neutrality in the long term is going to protect Austria's security. I think it's a conclusion that needs to be made, and that also needs to be said publicly at some point, if someone dares to do it. Yeah, I mean, it's quite amazing if you look at the debate in the rest of Europe compared to Austria. It's a radically different situation.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. You already gave me several hints. You mentioned Switzerland. You also mentioned Austria, and that both of us are neutral, both of us are militarily neutral, with the difference, of course, that Switzerland is quite capable of defending itself, which Austria is obviously not. And maybe also with, as you rightly said in the end, because I have the same feeling that many people in Austria who are supporting neutrality for different reasons do think that it also is kind of a security guarantee. And this maybe should also be something which should at least be talked about more critically, also from a political point of view. But even adding to that, I think there is another major difference, and that is, of course, that Austria is part of the European Union and Switzerland is not. And there is, of course, also this common defense and foreign policy of the European Union. Switzerland is, of course, not part of that too. So my question would be to you, Bernardo, now, talking about this concept, which has been quite popular before the invasion a year ago, which is a strategic autonomy of the European Union. After this, what I said earlier about this NATO brain dead and whatever, and that the Europeans should actually care more about their own security, because however we might play what is going on right now, I think it is fair to say that Europe is at a threat these days, because Russia and Ukraine both are more or less in Europe, and many parts of it are. That is not true for China, which is far away. That is, of course, not true for all the other countries who are quite, I would say, distant in this. The countries from the south, be it Brazil, be it South Africa or India, and it is not, of course, for Europe. So this is something else. So and there is another upcoming very important I would say, event, which is the elections in the US next year. I mean, there are also elections in Russia and in Ukraine, but I think those are going to be decisive, because depending on what the outcome there is, there could be a major shift in this so much confirmed transatlantic cooperation, depending on who will run the White House in the US. And I have the feeling, especially also from the military side, from all the experts I've been speaking to recently, that they do think that we should and we need to discuss more again about the strategic autonomy of the European Union. What is your assessment on that? Maybe also in relation to NATO, to the political community, to OSCE. So there are so many different formats, and nothing really is bringing us to the way which we actually want to face at one time, and that is peace, and in the sense of just peace, which is not a coercive peace based on defeat. So what is your assessment on maybe the the strategic autonomy discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I want just to mention one aspect, and then just not to leave too much space to the debate. That is about what the EU call an integrated approach. That is basically keeping together a wide array of tools and instruments that the EU can use. And I think the EU was able, to reach out also in what is called the external projection, and to achieve some interesting results also for this capacity to combine different instruments. And even if I think to the example that I mentioned before about Azerbaijan and Armenia, the power of the EU is also to work on that level. When we consider the CSDP mission, that's something, that mission is not a military mission. Basically, it's just a monitoring mission. So this ability of the EU, I think, is really important to keep this ability to combine. And in this combination, defense could be there. And that's up to the state. I don't want to discuss too much about that. If to really to say, okay, let's really have a European defense or army and so on. And that's the process that's going on, and for me it's pretty interesting. But that should not exclude all the other tools, because the impression that I had, I also focus on the Sahel, for instance, is just that a lot of energy now is just, okay, now with the EPF, with the European Peace Facility, we can supply weapons. Okay, so so the African governments are asking for weapons, let's send the weapons. They are asking to us, that's it. So let's send weapons. I think that is a shortcut. It's really quite simple. For Brussels to say, okay, they need weapons, they need to protect, they need to fight terrorism, and that's it. It's more complicated to keep all the different aspects together. So to say, so what does it mean fighting corruption? What does it mean good governance? What does it mean federal state, the case of, Mali, and how to really to keep the part together? How to keep some dialogue, the Algeria peace agreement together. That's more complicated, So what I would like to see, if I think to the European Union in the next decade, is that we'll continue to work really as a peace actor, able to keep different parts together. And the EU has the leverages to do that in terms of development cooperation, in terms of economic trade agreements, and so on. So defense could be there, but should not overcome all the other aspects. Sometimes I have this impression, also listening to Borrell, I will be honest, that we need to be strong, we need more weapons in all scenarios, not just Ukraine, okay? But everywhere it's repeating that, it's just promising, and it's okay, but that's a reduction of what the EU could do really on the ground, also in terms of pressure and so on. So that's my very first assessment on a broad view, and then we can move to the technicalities in terms of more armies, coordinations, and how to do this process. That's not my cup of tea. Let me simply mention two aspects, just reacting to what I listened. One is about the channels of communication, and Lamberto said, of course, there are channels of communication, for instance, between the US and Russia, because as a diplomat, as a practitioner, he really knows that that's the way. But I was surprised a few months ago when there was an article, I think it was in the New York Times, about a channel of communication between Russia and the US, about possible agreements and so on. But many analysts say, no, there is no communication at all. And I was a little bit surprised because, I mean, it's really dangerous if there's no communication going on, you know? I mean, it could be military communication, could be on nuclear weapons, could be on things on the ground about, but of course there is communication. Communication doesn't mean that there is a peace agreement. It's just communication. Even, yeah, it's back channels. That's it. I mean, it's between enemies, that's pretty normal. I mean, otherwise, some dynamics would be not present on the ground. And you also said, I mean, the moment is not there yet. And that's true, it's definitely true. I mean, the evidence are really saying that. At the same time, I think that the moment will be there if you get ready. I mean, mediation is a very long process and dialogue. And so there are, I mean, even China making pressure, not making pressure is something that is starting now. It's something that China will not just start making pressure and Russia will agree on something. It's something that probably needs to make pressure for 2 years. Or just supplying arms for 2 years, and some dynamics will change on the ground, and then, so it's. I think that's important to say that even if the moment is not here yet, it's important to have really channels of communication that are not in the news, because in the news are just blaming the others. That there are mediators. I mean, Turkey or potentially China could play a role. Probably we don't appreciate them for their absence of democracy or so on. But if they could mediate and support the process, why not? Okay, that's a little bit realistic, but I think why not, if they can play a role. And that's role, it's always important. Even when there was the agreement on the cereals, I mean, many analysts would say it's impossible, or we don't have to discuss, but it was an agreement, it was partial, but it was okay. It was a step forward, and I mean, it was good for Ukraine as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still do have a little bit of time, so I would invite the participants just to give some statements or questions in case they do have a specific question. Just raise your hand. I'm looking. Anyone a question or a statement? Yes, in front. Maybe if you can present yourself very briefly.
Hi, I'm Terry Hoppen from Johns Hopkins University in Washington. Just arrived in Vienna for the next 5 months. I mean, a lot seems to depend on how this war ends. And there are several ways that it can end, of course. One is that the Russians achieve greater control over more territory of Ukraine than they now have and declare victory and so forth, which will obviously have significant implications from the political and moral point of view for the West in terms of deciding whether to accept that or not. A more likely option, of course, is that eventually the Russians recognize that they can't win and look for some face-saving way out. And the question is then, you know, how do we manage that internationally, but also the consequences that that will have domestically in Moscow as well. Because clearly Putin has staked so much in this war now that the failure to win, the acceptance of even, you know, of any kind of Russian defeat is likely to create a political crisis in Russia. And there are opponents on both the left and the right of Putin in Moscow. And a lot of the long-term consequences, it seems to me, for European security will depend on then how that domestic situation in Moscow plays out. And so my question is essentially, you know, how do we manage now for these alternative scenarios, and how do we recognize the point where the international community needs to become engaged in managing these alternative possible outcomes for the war when it comes to an end, but particularly how it comes to an end?
Who would like to start?
Tough question. Tough question. The way I see things is that we will be more reactive than proactive in this. So we will have to see what happens and then adjust and engage with the new interlocutors we would find there. I don't think the West, because Russia, and we have isolated Russia so much that we have distanced ourselves. So we can have, how can I say, a sense of what's happening there. Of course, we all have, when I say we, it's the West, we have diplomatic representations there. So we have a relatively good understanding of who are the players and what the scenarios can be. But beyond that, I think it's rather unpredictable, including, the situation of the president himself, personal situation of the president himself, and how long he will be around, and there are all sorts of rumors going on, which of course nobody can confirm or deny, but we know quite a bit. And then if there is a succession, what kind of succession? Will it be in line of continuity? And of course the situation on the ground will play a role on that. So we have too many variables at play. And one of the angles from which we are looking at is, can we re-engage Russia in cooperative security? So I was discussing with the ambassador, actually tomorrow morning we will have a meeting on Helsinki +50 in the OSCE with parliamentarians, trying to look ahead. But of course, it's highly speculative at this point, because we don't have some of the basic parameters. And the key parameter will be, will a future post-conflict, post-war Russia be interested in re-engaging in a cooperative pan-European process or not? So if it doesn't, we all have a problem, because we have a problem in creating that space, either via the OSCE or via other initiatives that includes Russia. And that, because talking about security without Russia in Europe, it becomes, then it will be talking about common defense, and it's really a completely different angle, and we remain in a confrontational geopolitical environment. So I think it's impossible to tell at this point. As simple as that from my perspective.
Yes, I agree. I would have given the same answer. But I would like to add one more thing. I think what we can see today is the West trying to influence the one thing that they think they can influence about the outcome. And that is an attempt not only politically to isolate Russia, but to weaken Russia economically and militarily. Is this going to be successful in the long run? I don't know. It will depend on many factors that we've discussed today already. Like, is the Western solidarity and alliance going to be strong enough? Is it going to last long enough? What is going to be the support provided from other states around the world to Russia? So there are many things we will see in the next couple of months. But I think from all the things that we've seen, especially also in the last couple of days with Biden taking this risk of going to Kiev personally, to me that was an incredibly strong symbolic visit that showed that the United States is in this fight in the long term. That's my interpretation of it. And I think this is what we can hope for, is that the Western alliance also with Europe will be long and strong enough that we can see Russia sufficiently weakened economically and militarily that once the conflict ends, it is over. And there's not going to be another conflict either in Ukraine or another country, the countries that you have mentioned. I think that should be the goal, because otherwise any peace will only be a temporary peace or a temporary ceasefire. And I think that's what everyone is trying to avoid, because then the conflict is never ending. But I mean, I think it's very complicated and difficult to give a definite answer to this question. Yeah.
maybe adding to Biden, he also, I mean, he wasn't the president then, but I think he was a senator, and he also was in Sarajevo during the siege in the 90s. So this is also something, I think, which also goes through his whole career. And I think we very often tend also to forget about our other neighboring region, and also about what it is, since you mentioned that we need to have a long breath, even at one point, what comes afterwards. And that includes, of course, the European Union accession process for Ukraine, Moldova, maybe, and Georgia, but of course also for the Western Balkan countries. And I think this is also a very big difficulty we might be facing once fighting is hopefully going to be stopped. Would you like to add something on Russia? No. Another question, I see that Marilla has one here.
Hello, I work here at the Institute. I think someone already mentioned the countries of the Global South, and I'd like to ask you maybe to elaborate a little bit more on what role they can play, because many of them see it as a regional conflict, as the Europeans tend to see their conflicts in their regions, in their continents, and many of them keep still friendly relations with Russia. So shall they be brought into this discussion? How? What can the EU do? Any other thoughts on that? Thank you.
That sounds like a question for you, Bernardo.
Yeah, thanks for this question. The common answer could be no, of course, it's a globalized conflict because there are repercussions everywhere. And partially it's true, of course, because in a globalized economy, there are repercussions everywhere. And partially it's true because, I mean, if we think to Africa, if we think the Russian influence, the games that is trying to play against the EU, against Western power in general, and try to make noises everywhere in Africa. And some African countries really, I mean, really even scared about that, because they really have a lot of attacks in terms of fake news and so on. So yeah, there are effects in this East-West confrontation that is present in the African continent, but I think are very small scale to some extent. So the Russian is really putting little money, a few guys that are making noises. So why is doing that? Because, I mean, they like to do that, and they like to make noise and to attack the West wherever they can now. And they like to create embarrassment to Western countries, in particular to the European Union now. So if we think to Mali, basically they create embarrassment because the EU trained practically the whole Malian army. And after that, the Mali's new government just asked help to Russia, and Wagner was in, and Wagner was working basically with the Malian army, and that's created a huge embarrassment in Brussels. And they like it, in Moscow they really like it. So that's the game that they're trying to play. So on the one hand, I mean, of course, it's globalized. On the other, we should not be, I mean, too Eurocentric to some extent. Because, I mean, if I think to Ethiopia today and the horrifying conflict and war that there was in the last couple of years, and the repercussion with hundreds of thousands of people that died, and dozens of hospitals that were destroyed, and so on. And, I mean, no humanitarian access. And so, I mean, there are some catastrophes that are really huge, that at the same time are not related to that. And there are some other areas of the world, I mean, Southeast Asia, that are affected in terms of globalization, economy, and so on, but at the same time, they're really not part of the game. They don't feel close to what is going on. They don't feel, they feel that it's a war in another continent. And that is a perspective that we have to bear in mind, because 1 year ago, just the first 2 days and weeks, it looked like, I mean, there would be several countries against Russia. But at the end of the day are basically the Western ones, unfortunately. And Japan, but very, unfortunately, very little support out of the Western world And even in Africa, I mean, so many countries that they are neutral and so on. So I was a little bit surprised. I think we were a little bit surprised about that. But many countries, many regions in the world, as a matter of fact, they feel that is far from them. It's really far.
Of course, please the mic for the, yeah.
To this, which is the UN. Also via the UN, some of these countries, with China now engaging more, maybe Security Council might come more into play in the second phase, and hopefully in the final phase of the conflict. We might end up seeing even a UN peacekeeping operation there. We already have the Atomic Agency, UNHCR, we have agencies of the UN involved, but there could be a larger role for the UN, and that's where the countries of Global South could come out much more strongly and play a role also in the political process, either via the Security Council or in the G20 or in other contexts. So I frankly would see that coming, and that's where the West agenda will be diluted a little bit in negotiations also with other players whose interests will start playing a role in this process.
Would you like to add to that one? No. We would have time for one last question. Yes, please.
Hello there, Lawrence Kettle from the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. I particularly focus my research on areas of EU-NATO cooperation and those sort of areas. I suppose this is more directed at you specifically, but I would love to get the rest of the panel's perspective. Is EU strategic autonomy inevitable? Because there are so many problems in line with that. Financially, it makes a lot of sense. Strategically, it makes a lot of sense, and so on and so on and so forth. We know what the arguments are. But I remember talking to the Swedish ambassador to NATO, who was saying, no, we don't want this for the European Union. That is why we're joining NATO, and we believe we should keep it separate. On the other hand, you've got France that thinks, no, the two should go completely hand in hand, and that is fine. But realistically, if this is the way we're going, then the only way to create it is to do, in my personal perspective, you either do two things. One, you get rid of the rule of unanimity. No unanimous verdicts. You just suspend that when it comes to matters of security and defense, controversial in itself. Or you create coalitions of the willing, meaning if countries like Austria, Sweden, for example, don't want to take that kind of military action, then they can collectively do it amongst the members. Do you think that strategic autonomy is possible via just those two brands, or is there a third option? Yeah, I know that's quite a big, complicated question for 30 seconds left, so go.
Thanks for this question. 30 seconds. I mean, I don't think it's inevitable. I think really it's a choice. I mean, right now there is NATO and the EU is doing something else, and that's it, and it's working. So that's a way that can really continue. There are some actors, among them France, that's really trying, I mean, to have a EU that is also able to work on defense. But at the same time, I mean, it's trying also politically, if we think to the European political community that I mentioned before, one feature is that is the EU continent, the European continent. On the other is that, I mean, North America is not there, the US are not there. And that's, I mean, is something new for this kind of communities, excluding a lot of countries at the European level, but it's not Western in the sense that like NATO and so on. So I think there are pressure and there are interest in that direction. Something should be adapted, as you mentioned. So integrated the different speed approach, it's coalition of the will. This kind of approach should be there, otherwise it's not working. And there are also research projects and debates about that, how to deal in practice, comparing different models and so on. And that's quite an interesting debate. And I think that level is really necessary if we move in that direction. Otherwise, we'll be a fail. We'll not be really are able to work in practice.
I will be very brief because I'm not an expert about EU strategic autonomy, but I think what is fascinating, if you look at the meeting today in Brussels, there was a joint EU-NATO meeting, which was also attended by Ukraine, by Minister Kuleba, I think. It's quite fascinating if you look at how the war has changed the whole dynamic. I mean, it has strengthened NATO, but in my view, it has also sharpened the profile of the EU a bit. And NATO has also realized that they need the EU and that they need the coordination of the defense industries in the European Union so that Ukraine can be provided quickly enough with the weapons it needs. So it doesn't really answer your question about strategic autonomy, but I think it's right now the situation is so dynamic and there are so many changes we are all witnessing around us, very rapid changes that only 12 months ago we would never have expected. And today was one of them. I guess we're all missing Biden's speech. Who knows what he's announcing? I mean, it's so, yeah, we'll hear about it. It's so fast-paced, but there's a lot of change and a lot going on, I think, in this entire dynamic.
From my side, I think I'll be happy to join you for a separate discussion of this, but I can make some sort of headline points. I worked for 6 years in NATO as a head of a department in the Secretariat, and I was in charge of CFSP, SDP in the Italian Foreign Ministry, and then in Kosovo I was working with Solana and his people on setting up ULEX and the civilian operation. In NATO you have the US leadership that takes care also of differences among the Europeans and tends to push. And you see that I attended once as a guest a NATO PSC meeting, joint meeting. And even there, I had the perception that NATO was more in the driving seat in a way, and the Europeans were following in a way the party line. When it comes to only EU operation, I fully agree with what you say. The problem is that in European foreign policy, you need consensus. And you can't have military operation separate from foreign policy decisions. So you need to have a common line, and then you implement it through a military operation. And that is the problem. So the conclusion that you reach are right. I've seen the EU struggling. You know, in Kosovo, you have countries of the EU that do not recognize Kosovo. You run a rule of law operation. I had judges coming to me. I was the UN representative in Kosovo, asking me what is the applicable law here. And because some of them did not recognize laws passed by the Kosovars. And, you know, so you have constructive ambiguity at the political level. But when you turn it into operational guidance, that doesn't work anymore. You need to tell people what they're supposed to do. And so, yeah, you either change the way the EU operates, but I don't think that will happen in terms of decision-making processes, or else you go in the direction of coalitions of the willing, somehow supported by whatever, EU mechanisms. Or you really sit down and have a, how can I say, rethink how to rebuild this system. You know, EU operations, the way the time I was doing them, it was every country had its own hobby horse. So you go out to Aceh, you go to Mali, you go to Chad, you go to the Middle East, and there's always a lead country and others who follow you. Help me here, I help you there. But it's not really, or Somalia, the naval operation. You can't do it in that way as a result of a negotiation and everybody gets something out of it. So that the way I saw it, but it's quite a few years ago, it didn't look very good. So that's where we are.
Thank you very much. I think we already came to an end of this discussion, and thank you also for all the questions you have been putting here, and many questions, not too many answers, but I think it is still very important to look what we can discuss, what is the outlook, I mean, how the world is shaping itself, and how could strategic autonomy even look like, and even considering that it's not only about defense, I mean, this then makes it even more complex, so it's not only defense, it's also about energy security and all the other issues which come into security when you define it like in a broad sense of also including human security and not only defense capabilities. It was a pleasure for me to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming, for discussing with us. I look forward to discuss this issue even more. It will stay. Very unfortunately, the security discussions are going to stay within Europe and even beyond, and we just hope that at one point this war will come to an end, which will be also acceptable for Ukraine. And this is also the big difficulties the European countries and their Western allies are facing these days, because I think it is very important that we try not to tell them what to do, because the war is going on in Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian soldiers are dying, Ukrainians are refugees, and it's not Central Europeans, and I think we should not forget about that as well. And it doesn't even make it easier, but it does make our room of maneuver limited in a sense, and an acceptable sense, but it's not easy for us as well. Let me invite you maybe for a brief chat afterwards. We are going to serve a little bit of wine and water, so if you still have some questions, our guests might be here for several more minutes. Thank you so much. Thanks to Bernardo for your cooperation. It was a pleasure to do it again. It's the second time already. Let's keep that up. Thanks for joining. Thanks for coming. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.